live stream, a lot going on in the world. I have a couple of wonderful people with me to discuss all sorts of things. So if you are a regular, if you are a veteran of my YouTube channel or my Patreon or Facebook or wherever it is you're seeing it, then of course you already know Sukant Chandan. Sukant is of the Malcolm X movement based in London. He is my longtime comrade, friend, collaborator, and very happy to have Sukant back. As always, Sukant of the Malcolm X Movement at MX Movement on Twitter, Malcolm X Movement. That's it. And we also have joining us today our good friend Malick Doucoure. Malick is at Afro Propaganda on Twitter, the Ministry of Propaganda. He is an excellent wealth of information, particularly about issues related to Africa, but not exclusively. He knows quite a lot about quite a lot of varied subjects, and I'm very happy to have Malick with us again today. Malick, Sukant, welcome.
Good to be here, and so
Yeah.
nice to have our brother Malick with us. And I know you're very nice to me, Eric, but I know you went when you said wonderful. I know we both mean Malick.
That's right.
So,
Yep.
yeah.
Malick is much more has much more on the positive side of the ledger than we do.
You guys are too kind, no. I learned so much from you guys, so I'm very happy to be
All
here.
right,
Thanks for the
all
invite.
right, all right, all right. Let's all calm down. Okay. So this is the third live stream. This is the third live stream we're doing in 2 days, Sukant. A lot has happened. When we first met up yesterday morning, looked like we might be on the verge of civil war in Russia. By the evening, when we were talking, it looked like pretty much everything had been settled to some degree. And here we are the next day, and boy, it's as if nothing ever happened, right, Sukant?
Yes, interesting going through all the details of the research leading up to this conversation. We'll go into it, but yeah, it's all like nothing ever happened. What is it the Ukrainian leadership said? It's the most ridiculous mutiny or coup that had ever taken place. I'm not sure. I mean, there's a lot of ridiculous attempted coups out there, but yeah, we'll get into it. But yeah, it's far from over. So it's all very intriguing. Malick, any initial comments from you?
Yeah, Malick, you didn't come on yesterday with us, so what are your thoughts? I mean, just viewing everything that's happened in Russia in the last 48 hours.
I think I'd echo a lot of what you guys have already said and covered. I think your analysis has already been spot on it. I think, for me, I guess the scariest part has been the fact that, of course, Russia is a nuclear armed state. If I'm not mistaken, it is a state that has the largest number of nuclear warheads. So for something like this to take place in Russia is quite surprising. Obviously, with the Cold War and with, the global imperial world order that we live in, we're used to these things happening more in the global south. But yeah, I guess for this step to happen in a nuclear armed state, very much shows us how we live in a very unstable world, right? We live in an unstable world, and actually, it could end tomorrow. I don't mean to be a fearmonger, but things can really go south very quickly, as we saw yesterday within the space of 24 hours. But similarly, things can also calm down and take a sudden U-turn in an equal amount of time. So I don't really know what to make of it, really.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions. By the way, I'll just say for those of you joining us on the live stream, you can always, if you're on YouTube or wherever it might be, send us a chat, a comment. We can throw it up on the screen. We can talk about it however you want to engage with us. And of course, subscribing on YouTube and elsewhere is, of course, appreciated. Yeah, I mean, Sukant, drama, right? But farcical in many ways. We talked yesterday evening about some of the analysis from leftist voices in Russia. I mentioned Boris Kagarlitsky on his live stream, talked about how much of a joke it all seemed. A joke from the beginning, a joke of a march, a joke of an ending, that there are a lot of people asking a lot of questions about just how serious was all of this. What's your thought?
Yeah, I can understand it's been treated as a joke, but I mean, speaking partly to what Malick's comments, it wouldn't have taken much for it to go really nasty, And I think going backwards from that, understanding that I don't think hardly anyone was injured or killed yesterday in terms of what Prigozhin was up to with his Wagner PMC, but considering that there was no real bloodshed, I think that speaks really volumes, and that opens up a opening whereby we can further understand more accurately what the state of play is in relation to Putin's leadership himself and how he's trying to navigate this whole situation with Prigozhin, Wagner PMC. And we'll probably go into this more deeper, but my informed analysis, to the extent I have it, is that Putin needs Prigozhin. He needs Wagner PMC. And that points to why I saw on the ticker tape news today, I'm assuming it's correct, it may not be, that all charges have been dropped against Prigozhin by the Russian state.
Considered part of the deal, a central part of the deal, according to the reports that I've seen, and that that raises a lot of questions. How do you go into open rebellion and commit essentially treason against your president, the one who is the commander in chief, and then you turn around and all the charges get dropped? How can that not be an extraordinary humiliation for Putin?
Mm-hmm.
Good point. Good point. And I think as far as we say that there hasn't really been a lot of casualties, I mean, I think Putin's authority is the biggest casualty of this all, right? His rule has been undermined. And I saw somewhere, I forgot where, maybe it might have been BBC, I'm not so sure, but some commentator said that he no longer has a monopoly on violence within Russia. And it's true, right? He no longer has that monopoly on violence. He's now touchable.
Interestingly, Malik, that quote came from Podolyak, who is the advisor to Zelensky. And Zelensky was making the point that, hey, buddy, you just undermined your own authority. Now, I actually think that it's worth commenting a little bit about those statements from Zelensky's advisors. I mean, we could just say it's from Zelensky, even though it wasn't out of his mouth. I mean, these people are his voices, essentially. And some people, including people I know and I appreciate and I respect, who have kind of made the argument, and I think it's worth considering, that this is an example of sort of Zelensky and the people around him as kind of being somewhat deranged, as not taking into account the things that you were describing, Malik, the extraordinary threat that chaos in Russia might represent. Loose nukes is a phrase we all probably, well, maybe not you, Malik, but some of us remember from 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the tremendous fear that those nuclear weapons would, get into the hands of arms traffickers, terrorists, whomever, non-state actors, and so forth, right? So, but I do think that there's still an open question. Sukant, I want to get you in on this as well. There's real open question. Number one, what are Russia's capabilities given all of this? I mean, Russia didn't obliterate Prigozhin. They didn't smash Wagner. If anything, the military ran away. What does it tell us?
So I think, it might be worth in a future episode, Eric, us going through Putin's speech sentence by sentence, because I refreshed my understanding. I read through that speech just shortly before coming onto this live. It makes for really fascinating reading if you then understand what then took place for the rest of the day, and then what's happened on the following day, which is today. So Putin, in that speech, as you referenced in this live and previous, he called it treason. Okay, so it's very clear where Putin's leadership is standing. He calls upon all the military institutions of the Russian state to crush this. That's what he calls for. And it basically, nothing happens. There was some reports of some kind of, we'll come to this in a second, some kind of airstrike perhaps on a bridge somewhere against Wagner's forces in their northbound traverse. Aside from that, where was the Russian military at the beckoning call when Putin said, go, get him, it's treason? There was next to nothing. What the hell does that say to us? I think that shows that the whole monopoly of power, as to kind of follow up on Malik, there is no monopoly of power in the Russian leadership. That all the factions and the military intelligence services and the police forces, etc., they're all second guessing each other. They're all wondering, do we go with Putin or do we go with Prigozhin? We're not sure. So let's sit on our hands, and like the Chinese, let's just wait it out today. The Chinese said nothing through the whole duration of yesterday as well, because similarly like the Chinese, obviously people in the Russian leadership of the Russian state institutions are also thinking this could go any way, and we don't want to end up being on the wrong side of the victor. So they hedge their bets, it seems, to say, let's hold back and let's wait.
But this question of Zelensky's government and whether or not they're realistic in terms of the danger to the world and all of that, this is one of the major talking points that you have from people who are genuine, either on the left or elsewhere, who say that Zelensky is kind of doesn't worry about driving the world to the brink of another global war. And the comments that were made by Podolyak, or Zelensky's advisor, it illustrates this point, I think, very well, that for Zelensky and for the Ukrainian government, it seems much more important to essentially to conduct psychological warfare against the Kremlin than it does to assuage the fears of Westerners, right? In other words, the Ukrainians are like, look, we understand that you might see it that we're playing with fire here, but for our purposes, we have to engage in this form of psychological warfare where essentially, to me at least, it's clear when you look at the comments from Ukraine's government, they're trying to play on these divides that you're pointing out, trying to drive a wedge further between Wagner and regular Russian military, between business elites and the Kremlin, between advisors of Putin's and Putin himself. All of these are sort of cleavages, psychological warfare cleavages, for lack of a better word, that they're trying to exploit. So I want to get your thoughts on that, Malick and Sukant, about this idea of Zelensky and the Ukrainian government having to, quote unquote, balance between assuaging the fears of the West and the rest of the world and actually conducting a war, including psychological war.
Malick?
Yeah, no, those are good thoughts for sure. I think, I'd say since World War One, really, we've been in the age of total war, right? It's not enough just to perhaps reach a stalemate. It's not enough to, negotiate on a long-lasting peace deal. No, now we're in total war. The enemy side has to be obliterated. They have to be weakened to the point where war can never be an option again in the future. And I think that's how Ukraine sees it. It's not enough to regain their pre-2014 borders, right? It's not enough to regain Crimea and the Donbass for Ukraine's long-standing, permanent security in the area. Russia, or at least Putin's, Novorussia, I guess Neosaurus, I describe him even, regime, have to be removed from power, right? That is the only way, the only scenario in which Ukrainian security is actually permanent, right? It's not a matter of, when will the next war happen, or when will the next this or that happen? And you know what? I don't even blame them, right? Because Putin's been smuggling weapons and, of course, Russian troops over the border for the past, for second mass, but 8, 9 years, right? Since 2014, he's been doing this, right? He's been actively destabilizing Ukraine for almost a decade now. So I don't blame him. I definitely understand where they're coming from with that. It just sucks for the rest of us, I guess, because that pushes the world closer and closer to the edge. It's not what we want. When I was listening into Spaces yesterday about the Prigozhin coup, a lot of people were saying that this is another 1989, right? Like that we were on the edge of a new world. I don't like that, right? I really don't like that, and I think if we're gonna go to that extreme and go to that edge, I want this new world to be a socialist world order, right? I want this edge to be something that I'm actually dreaming of and excited about, not scared of. Um, yeah, I guess those are just my
Wait,
thoughts.
are you trying to tell me you don't want a right-wing fascist multipolarity? What do you work for MI6?
Probably. Nah, nah. Yeah, yeah. You know what I mean.
Sukant, what do you think?
Yeah,
I mean, about this question of Zelensky balancing and Ukraine balancing between having to appease nuclear frightened West and, not necessarily even the left, but just in general, and the need to conduct this kind of propaganda and psychological warfare against Russia, because it's clear to me that's what it is.
Yeah, I think Malick's last points towards the latter part of his last contribution is very important. And actually, you put it quite politically, poetically, quite well. But we'll come to that in a second. I think, listen, again, echoing somewhat what Malick has said, Zelensky has to play the strong leader, the confident leader. He's rallying his people. He's rallying the whole civilian population. That's his job, right? And I'm not a particular fan of the Ukrainian leadership, although I understand it's a relatively small nation that's enacting its right to self-determination against a colonial project of invasion, occupation, and annexation, and all the sordidity and the death and destruction that comes with that. So he does have the moral high ground in that sense. And I think it's important then to it's not, of course, it's not Vietnam, Ukraine, but it does have a parallel in a much greater military coming to occupy and take over your territory. And when Che Guevara says, well, of course, the Vietnamese resistance are going to win, partially and importantly, centrally, because they have the moral high ground. They have a reason for fighting that mobilizes, that inspires the people in a positive way, whereas the US soldier is there in a demoralizing, unethical, unjust project of colonial occupation. So Zelensky is kind of playing, and forgive me here, and again, he's not a Maoist or anything, so I'm not trying to befuddle these things, but he's kind of playing the Mao here, isn't he? The Mao Zedong here, in the sense that reactionaries are all paper tigers, that when Mao was facing the nuclear threat from the USA, he says, look, we're not scared of that. Nuclear weapons don't determine the course of human struggle and progress and history. The revolutionary masses do. Zelensky is saying a similar thing in a very different context, but there is a similarity. What he's saying is, listen, Ukrainians, and listen, the world, Ukrainians will not be browbeaten, will not be intimidated, will not be scared by this colonial invasion, which has the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. We're not scared of that. And in his own strategy and his tactical approach to rally the masses, he's correct in employing that type of leadership. Because if he showed even a blink of a nervousness in the face of Putin's aggression, then of course that's going to have a direct mass demoralizing effect amongst the Ukrainian people who are facing, who are engaged in resistance to this particular occupation. So in what Zelensky is trying to do, in trying to lead, he's absolutely correct. And actually, I've also said a similar thing, that we can't define everything. We can't understand what's going on here through the prism of being intimidated by Russia's nuclear arsenal. And perhaps there's a bit of a nuance of difference between Malick and I in that. But at the same time, Malick is not incorrect in what he's saying. And I'd like to make a comment on the last point of what Malick says, which probably points to something later on in our conversation. And I'll finish off on this part, is to say that when Prigozhin's forces in Rostov were being celebrated by a section of the civilian population in Rostov, who were they, right? Who were they and what do they want? They actually came across as the most pathetic type of far-right posturing wannabes. In their fantasies, they want to be a Wagner militia member, right? But it's that there is a section in the population who do want to push this into a more, even further toxic political direction. And that's the grassroots support that Prigozhin and Wagner PMC have. And you have that in the global far-right community all across the world. People just egging it on. They want it harder. They want it faster. They want it nastier, right? So I think we are, this indicates what Malick is correctly saying. We're on the cusp of an even deepening fascist revolution, and it indicates and it points towards that, which is very alarming.
No question about it. And one of the other aspects of this, it is a global far right project. It's a fascist world. It's a fascist international, if we're really going to use the proper terminology for it. And Russia has, as we all know, really bankrolled many of the far right movements internationally. Sukant and I, you and I were talking about this yesterday, and I think that is a worthy entry point into talking about what you already brought up earlier, Sukant, the speech that Putin gave just yesterday, which really in many ways was an echo, maybe an escalation, but an echo of the speech that he gave at the very beginning of this war, justifying the war. I know I've talked about it endlessly. I've done many videos where I've talked about this issue, and it's an important one, that much of the argument in favor of this invasion that Putin put forward was rooted in history and in a historical analysis that's obviously upside down, one in which Lenin is the great villain, There is no such thing as great Russian chauvinism, as Lenin defined it. There is no such thing as internationalism, as the Bolsheviks referred to it, and framed their entire revolution as one centered around internationalism. In other words, the Bolshevik Revolution was foisted on Russia. It was itself a conspiracy against Russia. Okay. Now, the reason I bring that up and the reason I use that terminology is because I think it's important to connect that to the terminology Putin was using in describing Prigozhin in the speech yesterday, whereby he talked about the stab in the back. He talked about the sort of conspiracy aspect of this, that it's a conspiracy against Russia, against us, against the collective nation, the Rodina, the motherland. Right? Connecting again the idea that Lenin and the Bolsheviks are the reason for the problem of Ukraine. That's the ultimate point of all of this, that without Lenin and the Bolsheviks, there would be no Ukraine. Without Lenin and the Bolsheviks, there would have been no communism. It's now also marrying the anti-Semitism and the anti-communism, which is also a hallmark of fascist thinking. Whether it was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as the great conspiracy to overthrow the Tsar, right? Or if it's the great communist conspiracy led by, treasonous traitors like Lenin and Trotsky, right? This historical legacy, as I'm being attacked by a housefly, great. This historical legacy, that is what he's playing on here. So what do you think, Sukant? Should I put up the quote?
Please do, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this quote is worth looking at, right? So it's a strike in the back of our country and our people. Exactly this strike was dealt in 1917 when the country was in World War I, but its victory was stolen. Think about that phrase. Its victory was stolen. I wonder by whom? Intrigues and arguments behind the army's back turned out to be the greatest catastrophe. Of course, for us, it's one of the great triumphs of revolutionary politics,
exactly.
Of course. Turned out to be the greatest catastrophe. Destruction of the army and the state, loss of huge territories. Gee, I wonder how that's relevant. Resulting in a tragedy and a civil war. Russians were killing Russians, brothers killing brothers, but the beneficiaries were various political chevaliers of fortune and foreign powers who divided the country and tore it into parts. Boy,
Right.
where do we even begin in talking about all of that? Go ahead, Sukant.
The victory that was stolen away from us. That's my favorite bit of the whole thing. By the way, I like the way you use Russian words in your analysis, Eric. I'd encourage you to do that more. It's just nice for an aesthetic and engagement into the kind of cultural aspect of the subject. So the victory that was stolen away from us. So Putin wants a victory of the Tsarist state in the First World War. He's openly advocating for that. Yeah, in that speech. This is so super important for anyone who thinks that they're a Marxist of any type of hue or kind or shape. Okay, because come on, let's just deal with the actually existing politics that's in front of your nose coming out of Putin's mouth. So Putin is arguing that the Tsarist state should have been part of the victors in the First World War. So then let's interject what Lenin is saying in that regards, right? So he is the counter-oppositional to Putin's kind of retrospective posture of wanting the Russian Tsarist state to win. Lenin is arguing anyone who is supporting his or her own imperialist government in the First World War is a social imperialist, is a social chauvinist. So Putin fits the category. He fits Lenin's description as the social imperial. Well, he's not even pushing to the left. Lenin, forgive me, Lenin is calling socialists who sold out to the First World War that social imperialists. So if they're social imperialists, in Lenin's definition, Putin is definitely an imperialist, at the very least. He's a Russian chauvinist imperialist. So that's what you're dealing with politically here. So what? But no Red Browner who claims I'm a Marxist-Leninist, etc. No one dares to make a critique of that. Why not make a critique of it? You can still love your, daddy Putin and still kind of employ the basic kind of Lenin critique to the situation. So I think that's just really, and as we've discussed before, and I think Malick is perhaps interesting for you as well, is the way the figures of Lenin and Stalin are instrumentalized and weaponized by the Russian leadership, where Stalin is increasingly put, which Stalin was in part, but he's pushed into an even more extreme Russian chauvinist kind of framing. naturally in alliance with the toxic Russian Orthodox Church and similar other kind of forces. And Lenin is increasingly treated as a pariah, as an enemy of everything that the Russian state existentially represents today and going forward.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with you there. I think your analysis is on point, especially with Lenin being portrayed as the great atheist, right? As the man who led the assault on orthodox
Mm,
values. No, you're right. I think, we have seen Stalin being appropriated. Or not really appropriated. I mean, yeah, you just full on taken as the face
mm,
of this red brown shift towards the far right. I don't know, a few points to add there as well. Like I think in Putin's speech, he directly mentioned Novorossia, right? He explicitly said that, which caught me by surprise because if I'm not mistaken, he had only really ever alluded or slightly referred to that being his political position. But here he explicitly discussed it, right? Like there's a direct link that cannot be denied now. There's a link between Putin and Dugin. There's a link between Putin and this fascist
mm,
irredentist Novorossia geopolitical aim, right? Like he's explicitly said that. But perhaps he said it, previously, but that did catch me by surprise. And secondly, in the clip that in the excerpt that was shared, I couldn't help but think the first half, right, prior to the part where it says Russians were killing Russians. If you look above that, right? That looks like something that Hitler would have said. It really does look like something that Hitler would have said.
absolutely.
The victory being stolen. Like that's literally, almost verbatim what Hitler
Absolutely.
was
Yeah,
saying
good
about
point.
the German army being, stabbed in the
That's
back
right.
by,
That's right.
right?
You stole my point, Malik. I was going to make the same point next. Go, 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 keep going.
Great
Keep it
minds think
going.
alike.
Yeah,
No,
keep going.
it's exactly that. And actually, Sukand, in the space that we were in yesterday, after a long time after you left, there was this Black American comrade who came in, started spouting all of this anti-Semitic conspiracies. Right. I'm very happy that you mentioned it, Eric, because I noticed that link yesterday. You explicitly discussed it, just a few moments ago. But this Black American comrade came in and started, talking about the Bolsheviks, how there's a international conspiracy to and he linked it into an attack on woke values. It was just the most nuts thing you would have ever heard, right? He somehow linked Bolshevism to vaccines and COVID-19, and I raised it because the link is there, right? It's becoming increasingly apparent that all of these right-wing conspiracies, right, all of these right-wing anti-establishment fascist ideas that are proliferating on 4chan, on parts of Reddit, on parts of Twitter as well. They're all linked. They are all linked, and it seems like they're all behind Putin now. And that, I don't know. I just find that very interesting. It seems very weird
Oh, I
for,
think it's more
right.
than just interesting, and I think it's more than just coincidental. I think what you're alluding to and what you're really touching on is the way in which the what we always called, I guess we could still call the sort of conspiracy ecosystem online, the way in which that has been weaponized, politically weaponized. Sukant and I, going back to 2015, talked about, I mean, the phrase I always used, I believe Sukant used the same phrase, although maybe something different, but I always called it an infiltration, because that's what it felt like. It was an infiltration of anti-imperialism, an infiltration of our political circles and our ideological framework. And it was an infiltration by elements of the right using alleged leftists in order as the vehicle to do that. And part of the reason why that was so apparent to me, why it became apparent to me by 2015, was because I was supposed to be part of that. Sukant was supposed to be part of that. They were recruiting people like us to give a left veneer to this right-wing fascist kind of politics, right? And Red Brown, of course, has a long history going back to the 1930s. We could argue about whether that's the appropriate term to describe it, but this Duginist sort of infiltration of our left-wing circles and our politics, that's really what we're talking about here. So when you sit in a black radical space and an alleged black radical comes to you and starts spouting this kind of Hitlerite propaganda, that is the question we need to be asking. How did that come to be? And we rewind back to 2015 and we talk about how they tried to normalize anti-migrant, anti-refugee, anti-immigrant politics and to turn well, in the U.S. context, at least for in the U.S. Black American context, the American descendants of slavery, right-wing movements that are designed to peel away traditionally left-wing constituencies and turn them to the right. And we see that in so many contexts. You see that whether it's with Black Americans being targeted by a movement like that, whether it's in the form of QAnon, which is targeting right-wing conspiracy lunatics and turning them into Trump foot soldiers. There's many ways in which this is happening, but the conspiracy ecosystem and the weaponization of that, that's very, very real. And that's at the center of a lot of this. Sukant.
Yeah, all concur with the whole conversation, really. I think it's interesting when we talk about Nazism or neo-Nazism. Now, there are some specific characteristics of Hitlerite Nazism that are not necessarily in other fascisms as well. So I'm not saying all Nazism and fascisms are the same. They're not. However, there's a certain propensity to essentialize and to make unique the Nazis, like there's no connection to any other far-right politics. And I think that speaks to the fact that the word Nazi and Hitler has a special, extremely negative connotation in the way it's been promoted in the education system and Western media and etc. And for partially for good reasons, although we know the hypocrisies of the Allied fight against the Axis powers when obviously the Allied powers were doing their fair share of colonial genocides as well. So, but that aside, the point I'm trying to develop here and make here is that on the one hand, you have this kind of political oversensitivity. It's look, not everything is a Nazi, okay? Not everything is a neo-Nazi. Well, you're kind of missing the whole point here, because the point is, for over a decade, just blatant Nazi pro-Hitlerite views have become really, really popular relatively across social media. You can track this just very clearly. It's not hidden at all. It's quite the opposite. It's out in the open, and it's easily accessible to the point where you have quite well-made animated videos on YouTube promoting literally Hitler's ideology, right? So the Nazism has proliferated. Nazism is not something just only unique to the German experience of its own period. It's representative of a global phenomenon. And this is what Lenin was pointing to when the socialists sold out to their own imperialist states in the First World War. And this is why I keep bringing in Mussolini, but Hitler is very important. And it's really very important, Malick, that you saw the parallel there between the narrative of Hitler in terms of what he says of the way the German state was betrayed, it was defeated, we are the victims, you know, we are a glorious nation, how dare they, we have to stand up for ourselves, and through colonial annexation and expansion and totally racist policies. I mean, there's a parallel there totally with Putin. And the more you read Mussolini, the more you read Hitler, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, etc., the more you see, oh my God, there's just a clear parallel, because the politics are simply a far-right, very racist form of nationalism that adopts all this kind of traditionalism and conservatism and this kind of building up this myth of this kind of this vanquished state that should never have been. And also, I think Eric was kind of kind of commenting as we were going through that quote of Putin's, and Eric was rhetorically asking, well, I wonder who that international conspiracy is. Well, I wonder what those international interests are. And I might be wrong, but I think you're pointing to this Nazi fascist construction of the global Jewish conspiracy. And then if you then fold that into what Putin is posturing and advocating in his speech yesterday, really, remember Hitler calling, what did he call the communists? The Jewish Bolsheviks.
That's exactly what I was going to get to. Yeah.
And Putin is pushing the whole narrative in exactly that direction. The liberalism, the global Jewish bankers,
all the Jews want to turn you transgender. They want to turn your daughters into your sons and your sons into your daughters. They want to destroy the traditional family. These rootless cosmopolitans. I mean, I could just keep spouting this shit all day long.
I don't want to keep coming in because I know Malick has to go shortly, and I'll hear more from Malick before his time runs out. But just one little point. If you study the way that emerging capitalism in what became known as Europe genocide of the peasants, and the leader of the peasants' women. All of this stuff is all back there. All of this stuff. Oh, that witch, she wants to turn your boy into a girl and your girl into a cat, and all of this kind of stuff. All of this politics is actually, it's a running theme in the reaction of emerging capitalism to try and defeat a resistant and oppressed communities that they're trying to dominate. Anyway, I'm not going to say too much. I want
Yeah, and thank you for reminding me about the clock. I know, Malik, you have to go here soon. So Malik, I want to ask you, I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you to comment on something else. It's, of course, it's related to what we've been talking about here. And that is the role of African states and African leaders in this whole Ukraine context, because unfortunately, we're not going to have enough time today to talk with you about Africa specific issues, because there's many of those that we need to be discussed and have nothing to do with Ukraine. But in the context of what we're talking about here, what do you make of the, I don't know what we want to call it, the middle ground, the gray area that's being inhabited by many of the leaders in Africa? And I want to make that point as well, because the leaders of African nations are not the African people, right? Because of course, as we know, African states, just like, well, states anywhere, are traditionally going to be headed by kleptocratic, narcissists who have no interest in anything but themselves. But the point remains, Africa seems, if not divided, then somewhat ambivalent about the situation. And we recently saw a delegation of African leaders go to Ukraine, and also back channeling with the Russians as well, trying to potentially mediate a deal. I think I have a very quick.
A delegation of African leaders and senior officials seeking ways to end Russia's war has arrived in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. On Friday, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa was met by Ukrainian Special Envoy and South Africa's ambassador at Nemi Shaive railway station in Kiev. South Africa has been under intense scrutiny due to the country's neutral stance on the conflict. This follows allegations that arms and ammunition were shipped from the country to Russia, but the government has denied these allegations, and
there's a lot more there that we're not going to watch right now. But Malik, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the position of Africa. You could talk about Ramaphosa in South Africa, although South Africa is kind of its own situation that needs to be unpacked. But what do you make of the position of Africa?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, as you say, these aren't nations ruled by the people. Not at all. No. These are national bourgeois states. Um, Many of them are illiberal regimes. Some
Mm.
of them are military juntas, as is the case in Burkina Faso, Mali. I'd argue Central African Republic too. Really, I mean, there is a presidency. There have been elections, but if you look at the turnout, it's shocking. Full of irregularities. Um, yeah, I would struggle. I would really struggle to name an authentic representation of the people in sub-Saharan Africa. And obviously that's a great shame for many reasons. But when we look at Africa on the international stage, it means that, yeah, we're not seeing African interests represented. We're seeing national bourgeois and property interests being represented, and that is the case with the war in Ukraine. I think the reason why Africa has taken its neutral stance is because it's clear we do have significant economic ties to both the West and the East, right? Um, the middle ground has to be taken because you'd risk alienating either side. Very interestingly, I read this quote from Kwame Nkrumah, perhaps the greatest Pan-African the world has ever seen, among the continent's foremost anti-imperialists. He said, paraphrasing, that independent African states should take no side in conflicts between great powers. And I think he's correct to have said that, right? And I kind of compared that to today's middle ground, the neutral stance that's been taken by the African Union. But the difference is we can't ignore, right? Krumah was advocating for truly independent African states free of neocolonial influence and oriented towards the socialist empowerment of the masses, right? Like this was the African state that Krumah was talking about and envisioning. Whereas today we have the exact opposite, right? Today we have national elites who are enriching no one but their own pockets and their own friends and family. Yeah, make about Africa's middle ground with Ukraine. I I don't really know. I don't really have a position. I think Africa's got bigger concerns, and that is, to topple its own oppressive regimes. Um, all of our foreign policy will reflect that domestic state of affairs. Yeah, that's all I really have to say on that.
Well, and I think that there's several ways of looking at it, but I think we all understand that Africa has been subject to yet another round of what you might call a scramble for the continent, a neo-colonial scramble for Africa in recent decades, much like the scramble for Africa we saw at the end of the 19th century, which, by the way, plays a pretty critical role in leading to 1914 and World War I and many of the things that we've been talking about, this sort of desire to remake the world in the image of the new colonial powers against the former colonial powers of Britain and France and whatever, right? That many of these tensions over colonial possessions, they're not the only reasons for World War I. There are many of those, of course, but they're a central issue. And similarly, today we have a kind of a scramble for Africa. Sure, it's not in the same form. The forms of colonialism are slightly different. It's a kind of a 21st century neo-colonialism, but many of the same principles hold. And this raises a lot of questions. Number one, and I'll open this up to Sukant as well, to what extent is the ambivalence that we see from African leaders, especially obviously not the ones that are openly supporting Russia, because really I think openly in support of Russia, Africa, what do we make of this in the context of alliances with China, the need for Chinese investment, alliances with Turkey, alliances with non-Western countries that then complicate what Malick was just talking about, complicate the ability of Africans to clearly take the side of what is obviously the invaded country. That's one of the issues here, is that Africa is the scene of brutal colonial exploitation and violence. And Ukraine sees itself in many ways as the victim of Russia's centuries-long brutal colonial violence. And yet the Ukrainians are like, how come we don't have sympathy from Africa? And then Africans are like, where's your sympathy for us? Where has it ever been? Right? So all of these questions, I think, are critical. Sukant, what do you think?
Yeah, complicated situation here, and what we're talking to. So thanks both of you for feeding into the subject. So I'm quite torn, really, when it comes to the African delegation in terms of their trying to present their peace process. I think I'm torn because on the one hand, I kind of like the fact that an African continental initiative has taken place and intervened. You know, Africa is treated like such a dehumanized, just shithole, frankly, by racist colonialism. It's so demeaned as a continent. And for some of the leaders to say, hold on a second, let's get this together. Let's go fly over to Kiev and Moscow, and let's try and do some diplomacy. I kind of like that as a counter response to the way that they're depicted in that racist way. But then I'm like, then I look at the detail of the situation, because that's just symbolism, really, that I'm going off. Really, it's not a definition of the political. It's not a political definition of the players and the states and the countries involved. Then when I look at that, then I ask myself, why is Ramaphosa and Museveni initiating this and leading this? What's going on here? And we're speaking to your question, Eric, in terms of the way, and also what Malick is saying as well, in terms of how they need to relate to all of these kind of poles of investment and political power, East and West, and as the East is emerging as increasingly competitive in the global capitalist world markets against the well-established Western forces. Why are they behaving like that? I think they're behaving like that because behind closed doors, they actually get on better with the Iranians, with the Russians, and with the Chinese. This is just on a kind of bro level of like banter and political chat. They do feel, and they're correct, that listen, Putin and Lavrov and the Iranians and the Chinese, etc., they talk to the point that we do get humiliated by the leading Western states, because they do manipulate these things. You know, they all manipulate these things. And then so behind closed doors, when you're hanging out in these high diplomatic circles, if a Lavrov is going to have a laugh with you about how Blinken was bloody rude the other day, or or Clinton or whichever high-level diplomat from Britain, France, or the USA, behind closed doors, Lavrov will cuss them out, or the Chinese leadership might, in their own particular way, might cuss them out. You all laugh and you get along, right? It creates a sense that someone respects us, because African leaders they're not totally stupid. They're corrupt, they're oppressive, they're manipulative, but they're not. They have a sense of individualistic self-respect, which is connected in their own deformed, dysfunctional way to the African continent and the state that they represent. I'm just trying to understand, like, why do they do these ridiculous things in support of China and Putin? Things that then kind of come out as looking quite ridiculous, because there was the first delegation of the African delegation that was sent back. I don't know if you know that. Before they actually got to Kiev. I think they landed in Kiev, but they couldn't get out of the plane because the Ukrainian and other authorities says you don't have all your paperwork. And then there was this funny story about tons of weapons on board the same plane.
Polish, I think.
Sorry?
Sorry to interrupt you. Polish. That was Poland.
Oh, that was Poland.
Poland stopped the plane.
Yeah, I don't know what. So they landed in Warsaw, did they?
Yeah, and they said they didn't have permits for the guns, as you were saying, that they were carrying for the presidential guard of Ramaphosa.
Oh, so the arms was for the presidential guard.
Mm.
Oh, and that's why Julius Malema has said now. So you've gone over to So this is why Julius Malema is doing his big posture as usual, opportunistic posture. So he's attacking Ramaphosa. He said, "Oh, the imperialist stooge Ramaphosa has gone to Ukraine without a kind of basically armed detail." So he's kind of sniped at Ramaphosa for that, because obviously what's happened, they just removed the armed detail and then just gone off on which again it is. I mean, Malema is constantly posturing, but he's taken an opportunity. His opportunism is not altogether without substance here, right? So
we've had. I'm sorry, Sukant, I want you to continue, but we have had a bunch of comments. I've been holding off on putting the comments since Malik has to go. But no, I mean, we've gotten several comments, but this one I want to put up because it's relevant to what we're just talking about. I will get to the other comments after Malik goes.
Sorry, I got caught up in some details here, but I think the details are important in understanding all of this.
So this is the question. This is the question, and it's actually kind of, thank you, Dima, for that. This is kind of the question I was about to ask anyway. Okay. So I appreciate Dima preempting it. So was the African delegation more of a proxy delegation for China? I mean, Malik, you know Africa, you lived in Africa, you've spent a good portion of your life there, and you know a lot about China's engagement there. What do you make of this? Could it be seen as really just, okay, China shit the bed and now they can't actually act as a mediator because they put their they put their lot in with Putin, so now they can't act as a neutral arbiter. So now are they just putting forward African leaders in their stead, or are African leaders really taking on an independent initiative, as Sukant was kind of alluding to before? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, the realist in me says that, of course, China's using economic agents, and incentives to, I guess, push its foreign policy upon the world. It's seen the US's strong arm approach and knows that it's not viable, it's not sustainable, and so China has a smarter, more diplomatic way of achieving its foreign policy goals. But the idealist and I guess the naive part of me says, no, China doesn't care. China doesn't want to be a part of that mess, right? China wants nothing to do with the international monstrosity that is the Ukraine-Russia war. And to be honest, when you look at China's stance since the outbreak of the war, they have been, I'd say, as neutral as you can get. You know what I mean? They've really tried to not, actively antagonize either side or side with either side. I think their peace proposal is fair. You know what I mean? I think it's somewhat fair and it's somewhat realistic in terms of, I guess the region's geopolitics. So I don't think it's a Chinese delegation. I think these African elites are going off of their own incentive, largely because so many African nations are reliant upon Ukrainian wheat, right? Ukrainian grains, and we know that Russia has actually been stopping the export of those grains from Black Sea ports, which is something I always bring up, especially amongst other Africans, Africanists, and Pan Africans who support Russia. I always point to the fact that Russia is more than happy to starve African bellies. And when I say African bellies, I mean the masses, right? Whenever we have, these blockades of Ukrainian grain, this isn't impacting Ramaphosa, right? This isn't impacting Macky Sall. This isn't impacting, I don't know, Felix Tshisekedi of Congo, right? This is impacting the masses, the people, the ordinary working classes of the African continent. It's their food, it's their foodstuffs. The prices are going up for them, right? It's them who have to bear the cost of these grain blockades. So when Russia is using that kind of, when Russia's blockading, and effectively, they're not saying it out loud, but they're effectively telling these African nations, you side with us and we'll let the grain through, right? You
Mm.
side with us, you take a stance on our behalf, and we will stop the blockades. That's effectively what they're saying. It's food diplomacy, and it's evil. It is evil. There's no other word. You're happy to starve people, right? To let people die. By the way, whilst famines are ongoing in various parts of the African continent, especially in East Africa, you're happy to let people starve simply to force the hand of these African nations that have independently decided to take a neutral, um, I guess, middle ground stance, right? So yeah, it is quite evil, and I think we can't blame China. I think these leaders are just acting off of their own incentives because we know that. I guess with the cost of living crisis, heavy inflation, expensive food, all of these things are ingredients for revolution and uprising,
Mm.
right? And they don't want that. And many of these nations are currently going through major political and economic crises. In South Africa, Ramaphosa is dealing with the power cuts. Like there's a lot of power cuts going on, and a whole corruption scandal as well. In Senegal, Macky Sall just the other week had to effectively deploy, the state security services to quash what was, in my opinion, a class uprising. Right, this was a class uprising following the arrest of Usman Sonko, who's a leading opposition. Sorry, following the verdict in the trial of Usman Sonko, a leading opposition figure who is very popular amongst the youth in Senegal. Um, at least I think 16 was the number, but either way, dozens of people died, many people were injured, and yet a week or two later he's off and out the country in Ukraine. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. If you're literally having to quell a class uprising at home, why would you be in Ukraine a few weeks later? The only reason is because what's happening in Ukraine is more important than what's happening domestically in Senegal. He cannot allow the cost of living. He cannot allow expensive foodstuffs. He cannot allow a rise in oil prices. He cannot allow all of these economic impacts of the Ukraine war to further jeopardize his regime than it already has done. Right. And this is, I'm going to generalize, this is generally true with many other countries throughout the African continent. The Ukraine war is really taking its toll economically on various African nations. And that's why it's such an important issue for them. It's foreign policy, but really it's become a domestic concern.
Yeah.
And with that, I have to go.
Yep, Malik. I was just going to say, hopefully you can come back another day soon. Hopefully, I'm not going to be attacked by this fucking housefly. And hopefully you can come back and we can talk about that. I don't think I agree with you that China has played a neutral role, that China has sat on the sidelines. I actually think China has enabled much of what Russia has done. I don't think Russia would have done any of it were it not for the, whatever the hell they call it, endless friendship or limitless brotherhood or whatever the hell they say about Xi Jinping and Putin. I think it's fairly clear that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was at least tacitly approved by China, and the idea of China as trying to then come in after the fact to play neutral arbiter, I think that's been one of the biggest humiliations for China, where they actually could have played that role had they really actually sat on the sidelines from the beginning. But we don't have time to debate that. At Afro Propaganda on Twitter, Malick Doucoure has been with us. Malik, thanks for joining us. Hopefully we'll get you back on soon.
Thanks for having me. See you guys
All
around.
right,
Nice
Malik.
one. Nice one.
Sukant, what do you...
Yeah,
go
just
ahead.
bouncing off Malik's last comments, which I found really, really interesting and made me think about a lot of things. Yeah, I think it's really important what Malik just said, because what he's doing, he's giving a very brief and snapshot of some of the situations in Africa and and how these African leaderships are trying to navigate it. I'll have some nuanced differences with Malik, but what he's saying is important to take into consideration, because I think, and to be fair to the African delegation, I mean, when was the last time there was an African delegation out of Africa that's dealing something that pertains so centrally to Western politics? I'm not sure.
We were begging for one in 2011, if you recall. We were begging for an Yeah, we
Yeah,
were
they came
begged.
late, and it was all a
Yeah,
mess. And
yeah, it
we
was a
remember all of
disaster.
that.
I was
That was
the only African delegation that I can think of was the disastrous debacle that led to the NATO destruction of Libya. African leaders, including Jacob Zuma, had very much had an opportunity. They were, if I recall, they were sort of begged by
you know.
Libyans to
But I
come
think the
and.
legacy of that plays into what we're seeing here on this
I hope
African
that's true.
delegation.
Well, I
No, no,
hope
but
that's true.
not in a particularly positive way. I'm not trying to say it, right?
Oh well, I took it in the positive way.
No,
Maybe, yeah,
well,
yeah.
I mean, I don't know how you judge this really, but like it's like there's still a deep guilt in the African leaderships about their failures in 2011 as it relates to Libya. And Comrade George Chiret actually raised this in a recent conversation in the last few days at a public event or privately, I can't remember. But anyway, so I think going back to Malick's comments, I think the African leaders need to try and show their population through all these crises, they're trying to do something on a big scale, on a global scale. Look, here I am. I'm Museveni, I'm Ramaphosa, I'm this African state. Yes, everything is just collapsing in front of my eyes. Yes, my people are increasingly disgruntled. Yes, I have 12-hour electricity blackouts. But here I am in Kiev and Moscow. Look, I'm trying to release the grain to feed you guys. Come on, give me some respect now, please. I think that's all true, really. And to be fair to the African delegation and their central advocacy in Kiev and Moscow, and by the way, Putin just totally slapped down the whole initiative very quickly. Putin slapped down the African initiative much more than the counterparts in Kiev actually did. Of course, Kiev actually totally disagreed with the African delegates' advocacy in trying to start to resolve this, because of course the Ukrainians will say, well, if as long as we're occupied, that's not a framework for any type of negotiated settlement, which is, it's just a fair point. Your country is being annexed by the much bigger colonial power and neighbor. But to be fair to the African delegation, their central demand has been release the grain. That has been. I can't deny that. From what I've read in my research in regards to their to their ferrying diplomacy in the African delegation, they're just like, look, release the grain, feed our people.
I think there's also, I have to admit, I think there are several motives here, probably an overt motive, and like you just mentioned, and several ulterior motives. I think that if you're a Ramaphosa, if you're one of the more, let's call it one of the more prominent leaders in Africa, particularly of some of the more influential countries, I think that there's a tremendous desire to create that kind of political capital for themselves in the eyes of the West.
That's right. Yeah,
here is a role that we can actually play that none of you can. There's no country in Europe, there's no country in North America that's going to be, well, maybe Mexico, but that's whatever. There's Canada and the United States and in Europe and Australia and New Zealand. I mean, none of these countries are going to be able to play the role of a mediator. And the African countries, well, the leaders of those countries trying to position themselves in that way looks also like a desire to kind of get something back from the West. Now the West is going to have to listen to us.
Well, that's their hope. I mean, that's part of the agenda, but it kind of then pains my heart a little bit. I mean, I don't really like these leaderships too much because they're so anti-people and so bloody useless and bunch of thieves, frankly. I mean, Tshisekedi from DRC, mate, really? I don't want to play to any kind of racist posture in counter response to it. But this situation of the people of DRC, I mean, I think it's quite well known. And then for Tshisekedi to then go as trying to play this role, I mean, like, oh my goodness. And of course, the West aren't going to give any respect to this African initiative as well. However much these African leaders want to do this multilateral kind of approach, the West aren't going to be impressed by it whatsoever. So it just adds to the kind of awkwardness that plays into that kind of Western arrogance against Africa as well. It's all just like there, all of it. It's just
there's so many aspects to it. Let's get a couple of more comments. I know we had a bunch, and I will say sorry to Tavish and to the other comments here, but I'm going to try to get to all of them.
Yeah.
Relevant to what we were just talking about, another comment from Dima. Thanks, Dima. Oops, let me do the first one there. How much grain does China, and it was a typo there, how much grain does China export to its BRI quote unquote partners in Africa? Great question, Dima. Would be absolutely germane to the conversation about Africa getting involved in these discussions in order to release the grain. It seems like China would have a tremendous amount of leverage in that. What do you think, Sukant?
Yeah, I've got a feeling Comrade Dima's question is rather rhetorical.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, but yes.
But it's a good point, isn't it? It's a good point. And as people say that China is somehow the alternative to the West that will resolve all the problems of a global South state. Well, try telling that to the Kazakhs, try telling that to the Sri Lankans, or try telling that to any global South state that's struggling. China is not going to bail you out and be your savior. That's just ridiculous. But there's a lot of people peddling that nonsense at the moment. And I think Comrade Shpakova's I think her comment is correct, because it's like, well, where is the Chinese in this? You know, the Chinese are great friends of Africa. Are they advocating for Africa in relation to the Ukraine war? Doesn't seem to be any indication of that. But perhaps we're going to take a few more comments just at the same time, Eric, so we can.
Yeah, sure. Well, we've had several as we've gone through this. Here's, let's see. We're talking about, a number of minutes ago when we were talking about Putin's rhetoric with regard to betrayal, stab in the back, this sort of Hitlerite kind of language. Actually, it's really typical of all fascist movements. Mussolini had some, variation of that as well. So this was the comment while we were talking about that. The myth of the vanquished state is possible only because Russia's on the weaker side of the inter-imperialist competition, like Nazi Germany and fascist Italy were. I guess that's kind of what we were alluding to, what I was mentioning earlier about sort of the war as being a product of the newly emerging colonial powers versus the traditional colonial powers, and the struggle over, dividing up the spoils of the world. What do you make of that comment, Sukant?
Yeah, greetings again, Tavish, comrade. Good to have you feeding in this, and my regards to all of our comrades and friends in India. Tavish, I don't know if you heard the previous conversation with Eric that we did yesterday. I don't know which one it was, the morning or the evening one, but Eric, I think important in response to your comment, Eric reminded us that Putin, where he really wants to be and where he was once, was a partner of the West, was part of the Western club. That's where his heart really, that's where his heart really is. And he wasn't always saying this kind of rhetoric that we're victims of the collective West. That wasn't always the case. That has emerged in the last decade or so as he's trying to justify, especially his actions in East Ukraine. And that was a whole kind of instrumentalization to try and justify what he was doing there. So it hasn't always been the case that Putin has postured as some kind of victim. He was much more confident and trying to engage with Western leading states at that time. But yeah, your point is absolutely correct. Of course, he is. He's building this myth because he's on the weaker side. I mean, there's not much more to add to your comment, really.
Well, and let me just give another one of Tavish's comments that came, I think, a minute after that one, because this gets at the heart of one of the issues that I've been talking about for a long time when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I mentioned this in one of our conversations yesterday, Sukant, the analysis that Boris Kagarlitsky had on my podcast back last September, where he pointed out that the tremendous accumulation of capital by Russian capitalists, Russian oligarchs, led to this kind of exporting of capital that is very much, kind of the traditional Rosa Luxemburg understanding of how these conflicts emerge, right? So there is a very traditional imperialist imperative from the Russian side when it comes to Ukraine. And so I think that that's, also relevant. That's why it's worth considering, as Tavish is alluding to here, that Russia needs outlets for that surplus capital to get more deeply into competition for raw materials, labor, and new markets. Exactly correct, Tavish. And that is not only the case for Ukraine. We see the same thing in Kazakhstan as an obvious example, where the Russians sent in their military in January of 2022 to crush a worker uprising just 6 weeks before they went into Ukraine. And we see it, of course, also in some of the other Central Asian former Soviet republics. We see it elsewhere as well. So that's a great point, Tavish, and that really only just bolsters the analysis that Sukant, you and I, and many others have had for quite a long time already.
Tavish, you need to be writing for publication. Do your research.
You absolutely do, Tavish. Give me a break. Enough with the YouTube comments. Start publishing. Send it to me. I'll get it up there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. You got another one?
Well, I got this one, which is always a nice pat on the back. Really appreciate this one. Makes me feel good. I'm sure it makes Sukant feel all warm and fuzzy inside as well. Yeah, so I want to just ask you, Sukant.
Can I just pause you there? Just going to big up
Yeah,
this
go ahead.
brother because
Yeah.
we actually met. Actually, it happened that we met again. I didn't remember that we met nearly a decade ago. But he's part of the Oxford grassroots, part of the Caribbean heritage struggle. So big it up, brother. Really, and thanks for coming on this live. And yeah, big it up straight back to you, bro. And I'll be in touch soon. And thank you for the little present. I know Eric would also appreciate a present like that if he was around. But yeah, thank you, bro.
I can only imagine what it is, but I want it. Get me one. Get me two. Whatever it is.
Presents
Yeah.
for all of you. Presents
Yeah.
for all the comrades, always. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, what was it? Sweets and flowers that we deliver when we see fascists killing each other, right? And that was something that we talked about yesterday, right? Where the question was, Russian fascists killing Russian fascists is good for Ukraine, isn't it? Well, yeah, kind of. All right. So in the final portion of our conversation here, let's talk. Well, actually, no, I forgot one. Here we go. Let's put this one up. All right, Sukant, let's talk about this one.
Yeah.
Let me
remove the big up.
Yeah, I got
big up to the big up.
I wish I was better at this. Okay, there we go. All right. Yeah. So, Sukant, what do you think? China moved to bolster Russian President Putin on Sunday, praising his, quote, strategic guidance and calling for stability. But importantly, not until the dust had settled over a short-lived mutiny challenging his rule. Boy, the timing of that was convenient. What do you think, Sukant?
Yeah, the Chinese said nothing on the day of Prigozhin's provocation, which was yesterday, right? Oh, it's been a long weekend. Yeah, it was only yesterday. Chinese said nothing. You got to laugh, don't you? You got to laugh. You know, I mean, what an alliance of convenience between Moscow and Beijing. I mean, you know, after all the smiles and the drinks and the clinking of glasses, you can only imagine what the respective leaderships are saying to their closest comrades after they've had the bilateral meeting. I can only guess what Xi and the rest of the Chinese leadership are actually really saying about what's going on.
Well, let's do a hypothetical here. Not that you're on the, not that you're necessarily in the, in the inner Politburo meetings or whatever, but Xi Jinping made a monumental decision about 2 years ago or so, maybe a year and a half ago, to essentially hitch the Chinese wagon to Russia's adventure in Ukraine. He came out strongly, I would say, and this is where I was disagreeing with Malick earlier. I think they came out pretty strongly on the side of Russia, making it very clear that they had Russia's back economically, which is really what Russia wanted all along, to know that if it did get isolated globally, economically, that it could depend on China for manufactured goods, for, financial services, for all of those other things that Russia, has been frozen out of. So this raises a question for me now. 18 months later or 17 months later, when it's clear that Russia made a disastrous blunder in its decision to invade Ukraine and really has no clear path out of there, is there any chance that maybe this undermines some of Xi Jinping's own power? Because part of the whole sort of structure of his rule has been that he is the most competent, that he is the, sort of voice that is able to both be measured, but also get out from the sort of shadow of Dengism and Deng Xiaoping and sort of remake the orientation of China. He's a strong leader in terms of foreign policy, a strong leader in terms of charting a course for China that's quite different from his predecessors. And he looks like he fucked up pretty bad here. So what do you think, Sukant? Is there any risk for Xi Jinping?
Yeah, people posturing that China is communist and China is red and all this nonsense. No, it's not. And this speaks to the point. Xi Jinping is a bourgeois nationalist leader with a legacy of a communist revolution and trying to manage all of that. But that was really annulled and kind of negated under the Deng era anyway. Domestically and globally. But that aside, listen, all the politics of every state leader is as trash. and it's usually right-wing trash. They are depositing just nonsense politics ideologically into the world. That aside, what's going on with Beijing's state interests geopolitically, not pertaining necessarily to the politics of the liberation of the oppressed masses and against white supremacy and colonialism? It's nothing to do with that. It's just to do with like how the Beijing leadership is trying to manage itself and its state in relation to Russia in what you've talked about. I think we have to understand, and this was commented upon in the news media today. When I was researching, someone somewhere, it might have been some Chinese university, but there was a comment made. Can you imagine if Russia descends into an actual civil war? Can you imagine the consequence on China, on all number of dynamics and issues and ways, but also the long meandering border that China has with Russia? I think China is just consumed with insecurity and anxiety and worry and just totally fearful about these consequences, and these things could happen at any moment now. And of course, this would be just the God's gift to the imperialist project of containing China, and possibly to kind of try and degrade it to the point of destruction. China has gained a lot as well from its relationship with Russia in the way it's kind of navigated that. I mean, we don't like it. And in the realm of politics, it's just nonsensical and it's not helpful to what we stand for in terms of our, third world communist, black communist, anti-imperialist kind of politics, whatever, however label you want to give to it. So all of that to say, I don't agree with the Chinese politically, but then I do understand what in the way that they're entrapped in their political economic project and the class interests that they represent. What else can they do? I mean,
this is a question. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, but this is one of the major issues for me, is just that I think, as I've been saying quite literally since the day that Russia invaded, I think that Putin made a world historic blunder, one of the great blunders of modern times, on par with Hitler's two-front war.
China blundered into that,
yeah. And China, by aligning itself so closely with Putin, basically also blundered, made essentially the same blunder. It's tangential to Russia's blunder, but it's a big one. And it has reverberations in literally every economic and political sphere, no matter how you look at it, whether it's China's role in the global supply chain. Now China is seen as a villain, a pariah in many ways, a country that isn't necessarily a destination for, Fortune 500 companies, for critical industries, for manufacturing, etc. Right? This was already a process that was already ongoing because of rising wages in China, relative to other countries in Southeast Asia. There were many other factors for why China was becoming less of the world's, factory, of the world's sweatshop, but it still very much was central to Western capitalist calculations. And because of this decision, China has really, in many ways, played itself out of a lot of that.
No, I agree with you. But your points and my point, they're not in.
No, I'm not disagreeing. Sorry, I wasn't disagreeing. I'm agreeing.
But they're part of what I'm saying. I mean, it's part of the same analysis. Is to say, it's a bourgeois nationalist leadership that actually has a big section of it embedded in Western finance capital. There's a nuance there as well that has to be put in. And because of all of that, because of the political class interest nature of the leadership and the state, they've made stupid blunders. These are not revolutionaries. These are not bloody. This is not Mao Zedong handed the baton over to this leadership and no, it's this. Come on, that's all the ridiculous stuff. This is why it's irritating that people are treating that they're not objectively understanding what the Chinese state is, what the leadership is. Because once you understand that, then you can understand it's just a bunch of foolish maneuvers. The BRI, the silk and steel, is going to become the new Chinese century? I mean, are you serious really with this stuff? Somehow.
Speaking of which,
right, China is going to just buy Africa because it's got that economic, clout to somehow replace the West. I mean, this is idiotic stuff. What, China is going to kind of operate a global revolutionary guerrilla struggle against imperialism and wins? Come on, this is nonsense. China is just a very insecure capitalist nationalist leadership trying in its utter foolish way, trying to navigate the growing intense hostility of global imperialism against it, and in so doing, looking utterly stupid, but then trying to cover that all up by this, like, we are an ancient civilization and state, we are measured, we are the middle king. Like, no, you guys are fools, and everyone can see it. Sorry, Thema.
Well, I put up the comment because it's relevant to everything that you just said. I mean, the fact that Ukraine was supposed to be part of the Belt and Road and had engaged
very important part of it.
Yeah, a very important part. But this is another interesting point that should be brought up here. Thanks, Dima, for bringing that up as well. Is that is there any way that we could see that China was almost forced to pick a side here? That Putin put Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership into a sort of a corner here by forcing them to pick Russia versus Ukraine?
No, I don't. No, I mean,
yeah.
If little Pyongyang can kind of now ally with Putin and chuck out the Chinese as he relatively has done, well, why can't the Chinese do it? I mean, sorry, I get irritated by that. I'm not irritated by you. I'm frustrated and irritated by the Chinese leadership because, I don't know if you've noticed, perhaps you haven't, perhaps other viewers have as well. I've got a little bit of kind of sympathy for them, because again, in the politics, and this doesn't mean that I support them necessarily, but like I made my comments about the African delegation in the Ukraine war, the racialized global politics I care about, and it's important, whiteness and its contenders and people who are trying to posture against it. It does feed into the very real lived problems of racism and anti-racism. And the Chinese, as a relatively much more racialized leadership than the Russian leadership, they should be actually, seeing some confidence in themselves and have been confident that they can navigate these things by not claiming an endless friendship to an idiot called Putin, which they must know is a bit of an idiot. I'm pretty sure that the Chinese leadership know that the Russian leadership are unreliable, that they're not consistent in their strategic alliance building with Beijing. I think they've known that for a long time, and they definitely knew that around the time of Mao and Stalin and Mao and Khrushchev.
Speaking of paper tigers,
right? So, yeah, sorry, a bit, bittersweet and twisted histories there, absolutely. But the Chinese have employed a much more kind of independent course, a more assertive course that gets respect. I want the Chinese leadership and the Chinese people to get more respect, but they can't because, and we go back to the class analysis of Chinese society and the nation and the state and the leadership. It's just so ridiculous and irritating. And then there's I was going to say little Kim, or quite fat Kim actually, isn't it, in Pyongyang, who's saying, it's like, yes, go Putin, yes, go and whack them in Ukraine, and the Chinese can go to hell and whatever. I don't know, there's been a shift in the Pyongyang leadership in recent years where they seem to think now that that Daddy Putin is going to give them all the goods that the Chinese weren't going to get them. Well, good luck with that, Kim,
Oh, my dear friend Vahak has checked in here. That's exactly what I was going to say. China is still affixed to Western capital and finance while still embarking on debacles and partnerships with Putin. It really is a kind of an ugly middle ground that they find themselves in.
But it's not like the Chinese don't have strategic hands to play there. Paul Janbazian, I don't know what heritage you are from. It'd be interesting to know. But anyway, thanks.
Vahak is my dear friend with an Armenian background.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So yeah, welcome. Thank you. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not like China don't have strategic hands to play vis-a-vis the West. They don't have to play, and vis-a-vis Putin as well. Why play this ridiculous role? It's just, again, it points to the fact that I think the Chinese have stepped into, they've been overly confident in thinking they can move from what Deng said? Keep your capacity hidden and just keep this developing quietly internally. They've stepped out of that into the world. And as soon as they've kind of made their second baby step, let's argue the first baby step was the Silken Road initiative that they did, which had some momentum and promise some years ago. I mean, it wasn't altogether a ridiculous kind of notion to build basically trade and transport infrastructure throughout Central Asia, going into Europe and other parts, connected regions of the world. Anyway, now it's all looking very sorry and very ridiculous. But I think the fact that the Chinese said nothing all day yesterday, well, I think comparatively on the first day of the Russian intervention in Kazakhstan, they quickly said, yes, we support this. They didn't delay supporting that situation when the Russians invaded Kazakhstan in January last year to crush the uprising there. But for the whole 24-hour period, the Chinese have got nothing to say when Prigozhin is doing a provocation. I think that points to the possibility of the Chinese leadership's thinking and knowing things are actually very, very precarious in Russia and Moscow, and things can dramatically change very quickly there. And they weren't sure who's going to be the victor in the situation yesterday. So they shut them. They told
That's clear. Yep.
They told the whole leadership and diplomatic global class, shut up, no one say anything until you get the green light to say something.
Well, that was a running theme yesterday. Russian citizens themselves were kind of sitting around waiting to see how things were going to play out. But I wanted to just put this one up from one of our other pals who's checking in here. Of course, we really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Leo. Really like that.
I think this is the comrade that I mentioned to you before.
Yes.
Leo, stop texting us on our shows, bro. Just get on a show yourself, okay?
Yeah, Leo, you're supposed to be coming on yourself.
You're a very articulate, handsome guy who's got a lot of interesting things to say. So come on Eric's show and go and chat some lyrics back to
How are you gonna turn that down? Listen to Sukant sweet talk in here. All right.
Leo's a great comment. Thank you, Leo, for your support.
Yes, thanks for that, Leo. So I guess we do still have like 10 minutes before we hit the 90-minute mark. I wanted to talk a little bit about how this is going to play out. I mean, I know that predictions are always iffy in these situations. Nobody knows what Putin is going to do, what the Russians are going to do. But given what just happened in the last 48 hours, and the fact that Prigozhin is theoretically in Belarus, his people are not disarmed. Okay, the ones that participated in the march are getting amnesty and are basically going with him. We saw reports in the press today that a retired British general who was giving comments, I don't know, to Sky News or wherever the hell he was giving his comments, who basically said, and it was the same thought I had as soon as I heard this announcement, he basically said, Kiev better be careful that Wagner doesn't invade from the north in Belarus. You know, obviously, yes. Right?
Yeah.
So there is this question of how much of this was theater and how much of it is designed to, I don't know, try to outmaneuver using psychological warfare tactics. I mean, if that's the case, and that's what this was all about, what an absolutely foolish maneuver by the Russians. What do you think?
No, it's not theater by the Russians at all. This is what it is. It is what it looks like. It is what it smells and stinks like. You know, it's absolutely putrid. And you know, if you haven't caught the smell, you know, you've got an incredible ability to withstand the stench of it all. Putin needs Prigozhin. Putin needs Wagner PMC. Right? Putin needs Lukashenko. He needs all of these. These are really primary strategic chess pieces in Putin's game. Yes, it means Putin will get humiliated. Yes, it means Putin will say, all my armed forces crush this treason and no one does anything. And he's left looking like a total idiot. Prigozhin won't be touched by Putin in Belarus. No way whatsoever. If Prigozhin is killed, and obviously it would have been, well, it may be Western intelligence services perhaps, but let's assume that because the Red Browners are posturing, Putin's got it in for Prigozhin now. Prigozhin better, you know, not stand by windows when he's in Belarus. No, it's just all rubbish.
Well, they were all saying yesterday that it was clear that Prigozhin and Wagner were on the CIA and NATO payroll.
Yesterday they're saying Prigozhin is the leader of the color revolution. Yesterday,
yeah.
And now what they're going to say? What they're all comrades? These are a bunch of idiots, man. They need slaps and just to be kind of slapped out of every conversation that exists on the planet. But you know, so. Putin, there's going to be more craziness going forward. Putin, because he's got no options, he has to bring Prigozhin back. He has to say there'll be no charges and no arrests. He's probably given more bloody treasure and material to Wagner, PMC, and Prigozhin. I wouldn't be surprised.
There's multiple levels of humiliation here for Putin too, because on the one hand, there's the humiliation of the mutiny itself, of the challenge from Prigozhin, etc. There's the secondary humiliation of the lack of response to his call to arms, and there's another humiliation. I mean, there's probably many more, but the other layer of humiliation here, Putin finds himself in this bizarre position where he is dependent on Lukashenko. That's the reverse of the dynamic that's supposed to exist. It's Lukashenko who's supposed to go on his hands and knees groveling to Putin, as he did in 2020 to put down the protest movement and the uprising that was threatening Lukashenko's dictatorship, right? He went groveling to the Kremlin to help him survive that challenge to his power, and he did survive it, right? And since that point, what's happened? Russia was on the verge of incorporating Belarus into Russia, the Union State Agreement, to basically erase Belarus as an independent country and make it part of the Russian Federation. It was supposed to bring Belarus to its knees and bring it back into the Russian fold. And instead, they got to go to Belarus to broker a deal with a Russian mercenary commander who's supposed to be one of Putin's close allies. Humiliation on top of humiliation on top of humiliation.
Prigozhin and Lukashenko are the proverbial bastards, but they're Putin's bastards. You know, he can't do without them, and I think that's so clear now. It's so clear. I wonder where Putin wants to. In his psyche, he must be having this internal conversation. Where does this all end for me? Where does this all end for Putin? Where does he want to? Where's the end chapter to all of this? What does it look like? Does it look like Putin being killed by some kind of internal coup, like what we saw yesterday? Does Putin want to go out like that? I don't think so. I think Putin wants one of two things. Either, like we said before, he wants to be somehow in the accepted club of Western leading imperialisms, or he wants to play as the great posturing nationalist to stop the attack on Nova Russia and the Slavic race, etc. But that's not looking like it's going to happen either. There is no victory. I think also now, there's a consensus now very clearly after yesterday that there is going to be no victories going forward in the battlefield in Ukraine for Putin now. Right, I think that's quite clear as we go forward. So where does this end for Putin? And I'm raising this. Maybe it's not even worth to raise, because does it have any consequence into what's actually going to happen? But I think it's important because, you know, Putin's ego, his own self-ego, has driven himself into this whole situation. So where is his ego going to drive him now? But the problem is, as we're agreeing, and as everyone knows on the planet, Putin's ego is looking very small. You know, what influence does he have? Does he have any more, really? You know, from what we've seen now from yesterday going into today. I think we should talk, if we can, about the response of the civilians in Rostov to the PMC Wagner presence yesterday.
Because let's do that. What do you make of it?
So first of all, on the one hand, there wasn't mass rallies of civilians welcoming Wagner in Rostov. We have to admit that. On the other hand, there was no great protests and demonstrations against Wagner as well. So if your leader, Putin, is saying, hey, we're going to smash this treasonous provocation, you would have thought people would come out to say, yes, leader Putin, you're right. And they didn't do that. I mean, the Red Browners were all doing that across social media, professing their undying loyalty to Putin as best they could. That wasn't reflected in the civilians of Rostov. And then to finish up on this, then what the visuals, then the optics were in Rostov with Prigozhin himself and his Wagner forces, is people bringing food, water, selfies, taking a wedding picture next to Wagner tanks. That was the propaganda outcome for Prigozhin and Wagner from yesterday. The people love me. They don't love you, Putin. The people want me. They don't want you. The war wants me to lead it. They don't want you to lead it. I think that's really fascinating. Very, very fascinating stuff.
I think it terrifies Putin.
Where is he? Show your face, bro. Come out in Red Square. Rally. your people. I mean, I'm not advocating for him, but I'm just saying, like, in the kind of the drama of it all, you think he might do that. Why isn't he doing that? I think he's scared of assassination, Eric.
Oh, I think there's no question about that. We see that every time he sits at the end of that long table. But
Zelensky is traipsing up and down his central Kiev all the time.
Zelensky's, thumbing his nose at Putin every time he posts a video, posts a selfie. It's like, where's Putin, right?
Supersonic missiles are being fired at Zelensky, and he's still traipsing around. Putin has got the
and it's very clear. We've known this from the beginning. Zelensky has run a very media savvy, not only a media savvy campaign. It's how he got into power, but he's been running a very media savvy war. This whole period. But anyway, the last subject I want to touch on before we go, as I can hear my children getting extremely restless back there, has to do with how we view Putin's decision relative to Western imperialism, because this is another aspect of all of this that I've been talking about literally from day one, and that is that the idea, and this is a red-brown, tried and true red-brown narrative, and it has been from the very beginning, that the war in Ukraine is about NATO and about punching back against Western imperialism, right? That the framework through which you have to understand Ukraine is Russia in a broader conflict with the West, with Ukraine as only just the theater, right? So if we were to accept that premise, and you look at the outcomes here, Putin is clearly the best friend that NATO ever had, right? NATO's boots on the ground have increased like tenfold from where they were in late 2021 and early 2022. NATO's, entire raison d'etre, reason for existing is now bolstered and reinvigorated for another several decades, where previously the image of NATO had been dragged through the mud in the disastrous wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq and Libya, right? NATO now is seen as a bulwark against Russian aggression. Finland is now into NATO. Sweden is on its way into the door. NATO's expanded its border with Russia by many hundreds of kilometers, several thousand kilometers, I believe, right? So in so many ways that you look at it, Putin has benefited NATO more than anything that the United States might have done on its own. What do you make of this aspect of all of this?
I might be somewhat mistaken, thanks. I might be somewhat mistaken, but weren't we saying that before he went in last February? Weren't we saying that?
Yes.
I think we were. I don't know if we were saying it after.
Well, I have to admit that I never expected him to invade. I even made a video like several days before the invasion saying Russia's not going to invade. That would be ludicrous.
Red Brown is also saying that. I remember George Galloway saying, well, of course
everybody was saying it, though, including major U.S. foreign policy analysts in the mainstream.
But that aside, but were we? I can't remember if we were saying before he went in that if he goes in, it will be a total blunder and he's going to lose, and it's going to.
I definitely
he's
said
going to give NATO the victory. Well, anyway, we definitely said that within days and definitely within a week or two of the actual initiation of the military operation.
Oh, the day of, no question.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not like people, it doesn't take a genius to work these things out. So again, I'm like, what's going on here? We've gone through this, question. Why then did he do it? Why then did he do it? And we got nothing else really to give other than that. He was dizzy with success. He was believing his own propaganda as a result of the taking of Crimea and the intervention in Syria, and then Kazakhstan, which seemed to be the real thing that really puffed up his chest to say, well, I can go, look at what I did in Kazakhstan now. I whacked these Turks in Kazakhstan. How dare they try to rise up against my sphere of influence there. Now I can do the same because I've done it. I've taken Crimea, got Syria, got Kazakhstan. Let me go in. The Chinese got my back. Now I can go in and get Ukraine and stick it to NATO, and they're going to have to deal with me. That was his posture. So, yes, Putin is not an anti-imperialist. If he was an anti-imperialist, he probably would have chosen a path of global struggle that would have looked like anti-imperialism, and it clearly isn't. He's playing the war on terror back on a Western ally, really, in Kiev. He's just playing the reverse and imposing it back on what he did on Syria. Now, you're right. He's been doing that whole framework on Ukraine for 10 years, as Malik reminded us earlier on in the conversation as well. So there is, what's the anti-imperialist going forward in all of this? Of course, the Red Brownies have constructed a false narrative that Ukraine is an anti-imperialist war. So obviously they're going to continue peddling that to justify their false posture. But yeah, he's given NATO, as we've commented before, a great more lease of life, a very unfortunate for our politics, a moral high ground for NATO. I mean, this is disastrous. When did NATO have a moral high ground? I mean,
that's precisely the point. He's rehabilitated the image of NATO better than any Western leader ever could. And it's very interesting, especially given, the alleged sort of antipathy towards NATO that Donald Trump represented, right? Oh, well, they're not paying their fair share. And I question whether we really even need a NATO and all of this, right? And then a couple of years later, here comes this asshole Biden riding in on a white horse, saving NATO, reconstituting the European alliance, bringing Europe into the fold.
Yeah, it's a good point. I wonder what Trump is saying about yesterday, actually, as well. I'm not sure if he's made a comment.
Well, I mean, I don't know that he's made a comment, but just knowing Trump must have just been absolutely gobsmacked that this could happen to Putin. He always saw Putin as kind of the strongman leader that he could kind of emulate in some ways. I think it's totally gone. And if anything,
number for Prigozhin now.
If anything, yeah. And on top of that, I would say that if Trump actually manages to get back into the White House, I would be extremely concerned about how aggressive he might get with Russia and Putin. Because at this point,
yesterday, Trump's got no time for Putin now.
No, and Trump has the bully's instinct, and he sees the bruises, he sees the blood.
Trump knows as well, exactly. He's getting the number of Prigozhin. He's probably going to get it. I wouldn't be surprised they're chatting on Telegram already and trying to, broker some kind of dialogue going forward. Because Prigozhin would give, sorry to use this imagery, but give Trump big, well, not big obviously, but we'll give him a hard on, wouldn't he? Trump would be so super excited about what Prigozhin has done yesterday. He'll be bouncing. I'm sure he's jumping around his room with his,
Trump, above all else, Trump respects those with balls, right? And that's the position that, as you said yesterday in our conversation, that's the sort of posture that Prigozhin has created for himself. I'm the only one with balls here. It's not Shoigu. It's not Gerasimov. It's not Putin.
Where are Shoigu and Gerasimov? Where are they?
Well, that's another interesting question, especially since the rumors are that their heads are the ones that are being delivered to Prigozhin. Proverbially. Yeah, that Shoigu's out and Gerasimov is out. That's the rumor. I don't know. I mean,
because what would make sense if they're still part of the leadership of the state is to come out yesterday and come out today and really kind of stick it back to Prigozhin, but they seem to be absent.
Well, right? it seems like their days of being able to posture in that way are over, potentially.
What is all of this, Eric? This is just crazy. It's just amazing. Amazing. Absolutely. And you know what's interesting? The West is actually a little bit muted about all of this. Of course, there's headlines. I've been following the news, the TV media and the print media. They've even explicitly referenced that the US leadership aren't going to make big hay out of this because for obvious reasons, they don't want to be, they don't want to give any kind of any fuel to the fire that says this is some kind of a Western intelligence kind of a back provocation. But they've been a little bit muted. This is high drama. This is intense, crazy political developments, and I don't know if you found that.
I did, and I have to admit that it's another one of the reasons why I'm pretty convinced that this was all very genuine, that this was not faked. The fact is that if this were fake, I have a feeling that U.S. intelligence would have already said that they had the information that this was staged and this and that. I mean, that was the tactic they used leading up to the war. If you recall, the CIA was releasing information damn near every day about troop buildups, about Russia's going to invade. And many of us who have been trained to think everything that they say is a lie, we're like, well, that's bullshit. And then it happened. Right. So I have a feeling that if the U.S. had the intelligence to say that, well, actually, this has been staged and Prigozhin and Putin are still thick as thieves, that information would be out. And so I have a feeling that they're cautious approach to all of this is because they really were waiting to see how this was all going to play out. And of course, there's also the question about the nuclear arsenal that Malick brought up earlier. There's the question about destabilization of Russia and the unpredictable outcomes that might have, et cetera. That's all true. But I really do believe that their kind of muted position on all of this is because they know that it's genuine.
Yeah, again, I don't want to parallel. Yeah, I agree. I don't want to parallel Lenin Prigozhin the way Putin did. But I think Lenin did say, "Who dares wins," and Prigozhin has definitely dared and dared and dared and won and won. And we didn't win Bakhmut, but that's an important part of the story which leads up to this as well.
Actually, that reminds me, there was a story I read today. I don't know if this has been confirmed or not, but allegedly in the Discord leaks was the information from the U.S. intelligence, which was then leaked on Discord, that Prigozhin had back-channel dealings with Ukrainian intelligence, offering them Russian troop positions in exchange for them letting him have Bakhmut. Right, so that he could take the PR victory, and then in exchange he would give them the location of Russian troops to bomb and slaughter. I mean, I don't know if that's true or.
Yeah, it's not altogether unbelievable.
It's not unbelievable, no. But it came out of U.S. intelligence, so it could also be disinformation.
No, of course it could. But just to speculate where it might be an actuality is that. So Prigozhin is very clear that the rest of the Russian military are shit on the battlefield. They're failures. They're useless. They're corrupt. They're failing the real vanguard, which is his PMC, Wagner. So then for him to take Bakhmut, which would be a strategic victory for the Russian endeavor in Ukraine, and then for the Ukrainians to blast a whole bunch of what Prigozhin considers, and to some extent it's true, just useless, whatever forces of it kind of, right.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It wouldn't surprise me if it
all
were
the
true.
behavior now we've seen from yesterday until today, well, it kind of like, okay, then I think relatively we're like, well, that might have been the case then. Whereas day before yesterday, we'd probably be speculating, nah, does that really make sense? But now it's like, well, yeah, that makes total sense, So what's going to happen to Shoigu and Gerasimov? What's going to happen to them?
I don't know. I would imagine they're probably going to be given the benefit of a quiet exit into anonymity, I guess. I don't know. I don't believe they're going to be, pilloried, tarred and feathered and executed on stage, but I do think that, well, that's what he wants. And it's very clear that he's gotten those concessions to some degree. And if there is going to be an announcement of a new Minister of Defense or a new, general leading the campaign, that's yet another level of humiliation for Putin.
Do you think, like we referenced this briefly, do you think Prigozhin and Lukashenko are going to do a provocation through Belarus into Ukraine? I'm not sure.
I don't know. I'm cautious with making any prediction of this because it is also fluid and it's hard to say. Plus, my track record of predictions of what the Russians are going to do has been pretty shoddy when it comes to Ukraine, at least in the very beginning. Since then, I've been pretty good. But I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I have a feeling the answer is no, because I have a feeling that they already know that they can't. That Wagner is never going to make it to Kiev, right? The Ukrainians have had 18 months to prepare for all of these contingencies. The fact that Wagner, with its fairly small numbers, meaning the numbers that actually ultimately may have gone to Belarus, I'm not buying it. I don't think the Chechens could do it in February of 2022, and I don't think that Wagner could do it at any point in 2023. As every military analyst has said from the very beginning, the only way the Russians were going to make it to Kiev is by bombing their way there, and by bombing mercilessly. All the way there. Or Syria or whatever, right? And they have shown an unwillingness to do that. Maybe that can change. It could certainly change if there were a change in leadership in Russia. But I also think that they've lost the political capital to be able to get away with something like that. How are those African countries and all of those others that are kind of on the fence and walking the line here when that kind of genocidal aerial bombardment campaign goes on? I think it's going to be politically much more difficult for them.
I agree, but Putin must know it's all starting to really collapse now around him, and it's going to be just very fascinating what happens next couple of days and
Absolutely. It's all changing hour by hour and day by day. We're going to leave it there. We're approaching an hour and 45. I think we can do this again. Hopefully in the coming days, we'll get Malick to come back. Maybe we can get some others to come on and chat with us.
Leo, just shout to Leo. Come and chat with us. It'll be good to have you, because you've been partially if you don't mind me saying, in South Africa as well. So it'll be good to get your perspective. Sorry, Eric.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. And actually, let me just put up one more comment here before we go. This is my wonderful dear friend, Patricia. Can Putin have an off-ramp, quote unquote, as the liberals said, by blaming Prigozhin? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, that came into my head as well. That's what I was getting at, to be honest. Partly what I was getting at is what's going through Putin's mind. I'm sure it's gone through and is going through his mind. Putin thinking, maybe I wish I could just get rid of all of these toxic pieces of shit and just try and cut a deal with the West now and just preserve my state, preserve myself, preserve my leadership, preserve my family in its top echelon position, because it's all falling down.
Yeah, unfortunately for him, I think he crossed that Rubicon a long time ago, and there is no going back to that. There is no bringing him back to the G8 table. There is no, Western partners and all of that. That ship has sailed, and that's part of the danger in all of this, is that there is no going back. And so it certainly raises the question of just how far Russia's potentially going to go with all of this. And well, quite frankly, I don't know that any of us know. So anyway, we're going to have to leave it there. Sukant Chandan of the Malcolm X movement, at MX Movement on Twitter. Yep. And of course, as always, I would urge, plead, beg people to go to my Patreon, because I'm shameless in that way. Patreon.com/Eric Draitser. There's a lot of subscriber only stuff there. There's a lot of things that are available for public consumption as well. Patreon.com/Eric Draitser. You can get a lot more of these and many more conversations like this. There's going to come a point pretty soon where Sukant and I, and maybe others, are going to do these live streams for subscribers only. So maybe that's another little bonus push to get you over the edge there. But anyway, that's enough of that. Sukant, thank you, as always, for all of your great work.
Thanks, Eric. And just picking up Counter Narrative News on YouTube as well.
Oh, yes.
Go check it out, people. No problem at all.
Counter Narrative News, that's another one that really should be part of your rotation. We'll talk again very, very soon.
Respect.
Peace out. Peace.
Respect. Thank you.